Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
There's lots of names for it, many of them inappropriate for the current setting.
Yeah, we'll just let people's mind wander.
And we're live.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I did click record, didn't I? Yeah. Well, it seemed like our last episode with Craig was pretty popular.
Mm-hmm.
Saw it getting shared around online. Folks, always love him as a guest. And obviously the content is great, and that all the fire season research that he's been leading has been really excellent. So I feel like that was reflected in the response from the audience,
right?
But it did get me thinking, between that and us doing some of the stuff with Onyx here recently for that master class, our upcoming training that we're getting prepped for. I've been really diving in on different components of habitat for wild turkeys, and in particular, I think we should start going through some of those, and we've definitely gotten plenty of requests to do that.
Right.
So I would say the one that's most common that we get requests about is, what does nesting cover look like?
Yeah.
So I was going to propose that we try to focus on that today. As our topic, let's talk about, what does nesting cover look like? Is there such a thing?
Yeah.
How strong is selection for turkeys for particular types of nesting cover? Because I hear people say stuff like, "Oh, they'll nest anywhere."
Yeah. That's what I was gonna prompt you with that question to kind of start it off. It does seem like I encounter a good number of people that believe that there's not really such a thing as nesting cover, and that they've seen and they use as evidence of that they've seen hens nest on a roadside ditch, right?
Yeah.
Or they've seen them nest in
Or
a
just
completely open hardwood forest or something like that.
Yeah,
and
like
that
up
leads
against
them,
an oak tree in the middle of wide open woods.
and that leads them to conclude that there's not really such a thing as nesting cover. So, what does the literature tell us about that?
Well, I will preface with this, that I don't discount. I've walked up on nests and I scratch my head.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that sometimes nests are in places that don't seem like they should nest there.
Right.
That's common.
Right.
Especially if there's not what I would call high quality nesting cover widely available.
Yeah. That's the other half of the story, right? Is a number of these scenarios that I'm mentioning or describing, and even some of the research that's been done has not considered whether, what is actually available to nest in on that landscape.
Right. Yeah, I think that definitely is true. And the other thing, just to be blunt about it to people, a hen will nest up against an oak tree in the middle of wide open woods, but you don't want her to do that.
Right.
That is a poor choice.
Yeah.
And, I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of, let's provide enough high quality options so that even if they were weak selectors, they would still end up in good cover that would promote success of the nest and the hen while she's on the nest, and brooding if she pulls the nest off.
Yeah, that's one thing that I would caution people against at the outset of this conversation is, don't assume that just because you see a turkey nest in some place means that is a good place for it to be.
Yeah.
because hens are, they can only nest in what's available to them. And
Yeah.
I think a great parallel to this, keeping with the theme of turkey selection versus what is actually available, is that there's a number of studies out there, many of them going decades back, that showed that Bahia grass seeds are a preferred food item for wild turkey adults. And it shows up in all these, wild turkey diet studies, and that led many people to conclude for a relatively long time that Bahia grass was something that was good to plant for turkeys. And
Yeah, that's the ticket, because we see
yeah,
them out in fields and we
yeah.
find it in their diet.
And there's two things there. One is, don't assume that just because they're eating it, it's the best thing for them to eat. It might just simply be that that's all that's really available for them in a high abundance. But here's the other thing too: is do we have any evidence that turkeys are actually adult turkeys are lacking food across the landscape, and that's actually what's limiting populations? Because what I would argue is way more limiting, and we've talked about a lot on this show, is that brooding cover is much more limiting, and Bahia grass definitely stands in the way of that objective, right? So
Yeah.
brooding cover is way more limited than food sources for adult turkeys. And so even if that is a decent food source, let's just start with the premise that it is for this example's sake, we still probably would want to get rid of that because brooding cover is way more limiting.
Yep.
I think that was a fair analogy.
I think so. It's the use versus availability argument that we consistently get into. If you put a hen in a gymnasium, she's going to 100% of the time nest in the gymnasium, right? Like that's kind of a facetious example. Like, if most of her choices are bad, then she's probably going to make a bad choice.
Yeah, she can't help but.
Right. It's our job as managers, gamekeepers, however you want to look at that. It's our job to provide her good options so that she can choose wisely.
That's right.
Or maybe just accidentally end up in something good.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to address your question directly, which I believe was, is there strong selection or something along those lines?
That's it.
I would say, based on going through the literature, that the selection has been very strong for particular characteristics.
Yeah.
So when I hear that weak selector, I don't know that I would agree with that. I guess if we're in a context where there aren't good choices, or where everything is relatively similar across the landscape, you might see weaker selection in that context. But when you go back to the Dixon book, 1992, I believe was the year, and look at the body of evidence, even just that had accumulated in the 70s and 80s, there was already evidence of really strong selection for particular traits. And I'll read you something, I guess paraphrase what one of the things in that chapter, which this was Bill Porter, his chapter on habitat requirements for wild turkeys. There's other chapters that have similar information to this as well, I'll note. But he wrote that they're often found at the base of trees, in logging slash or shrub cover or herbaceous vegetation. And the characteristic that is common surrounding nests from wild turkeys is lateral cover.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, what is producing lateral cover can vary based, it could be different types of vegetation or woody debris, different things can produce that lateral cover, but that's really consistent. Lateral cover, and they even wrote, all, whether you're talking about in Alabama or Oregon or anywhere in between, that characteristic has commonly been selected for higher lateral cover.
Mm-hmm.
And what he meant by that, he went on to define as well-developed vegetation 1 meter above the ground.
Right.
Right. So we're talking about somewhere between waist high to the ground. So that's what he wrote at that time, and he had a number of examples. The one that I think is potentially most compelling was from Speke's work in Alabama, where in that landscape, only 0.6% of the available landscape, which was primarily right-of-ways and small openings, 0.6% of that was available, and 37% of the nests that they found in their study occurred in those areas.
Oh, wow. I've never come across that result before, and that's directly from Alabama.
Yeah, that was Everett, 1982.
Okay. 0.6% of the landscape and 30-something% of nests were found there?
Yeah, and they pointed specifically to rights of way, and I think it's because most of the early successional high quality lateral cover was associated with those rights of way.
So these would be like power lines, gas lines, roadsides.
Yeah, so in the landscape they were in, most of the high sunlight environment, where you have that kind of that well-developed vegetation at the ground.
Basically anywhere you don't have trees.
Yeah. That was where it was concentrated, and 37% of the nests occurred in just 0.6% of the area. And that's in those areas...
Yeah, that's the strongest selection I think I've ever heard.
Yeah, even across species.
I know. Yeah, 0.6%, and over a third of the animals chose those areas.
Yeah. And they were choosing it, he wrote something along the lines of only when vegetation height was exceeding 10 inches. So when you're talking about that well-developed ground cover, we are talking about it being up, near the height of the hen at least.
Right.
And then from that same study, 73% of the nests occurred in developed herb and shrub vegetation within the landscape.
Right.
So when you actually look at the fine scale, almost all of the nest site choices did have relatively well-developed structure in that ground level. So pretty clear selection where 3/4 of the birds in the landscape were selecting that same kind of color. If we kind of look around in different places, they, in that chapter, outlined several other sources. One was in Minnesota. The nests in that study, this was Lazarus and Porter, so some of Bill Porter's work, the nests occurred, or the hens were selecting to nest in stands with only 40% canopy closure, preferentially, or in open fields near the edges of woods. Same thing with that structure. In Oregon, this was Lutz and Crawford in the late 80s, 1987. This was in Douglas fir stands. They were selectively nesting in stands with less than 50% canopy cover, and again, dense lateral cover. So, we're starting to build evidence. That was 3 studies pretty much across the entire range of turkeys. We have another study from Georgia, well-developed lateral cover, and he did note this was a weaker selection, but I think it's going to bring back a memory for you when I say this. Well-developed cover directly overhead between 0.5 meter and 3 meters in height. And this was in Georgia, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and if you remember talking to Craig Harper about this, also recently in Tennessee.
Yep.
A characteristic that was commonly associated with nest site selection.
Yeah.
So that characteristic doesn't seem to be as strongly selected, but it is pretty common.
It also, I would guess, is even rarer than the just having good lateral screening cover. Having both of those, like lateral screening and overhead,
Yeah,
is probably even harder to find.
yeah, I agree with that. It's probably easier to select for lateral cover
Yeah,
because it's generally more common.
yeah.
And then when you can do that and have the directly overhead cover.
What do you think it is about the overhead cover? Do you think I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is preventing avian nest predation, right? From like crows,
Mhm.
blue jays, and so on. But do you think it's that, or do you think it's just that those areas that have more overhead concealment cover are just better concealed overall?
Well, I definitely think it's better concealment overall, but I could see there being multiple benefits. One, you're concealed from an overhead predator, an avian predator or something that might, steal eggs, like a crow or something. So I could see it conveying benefit there. It also is providing some shelter directly over the hen from the elements, particularly rain.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see it conveying benefit there as well. Not, but by allowing her to escape the elements and potentially, if it's keeping her more dry,
Yeah.
there are a few studies that we have talked about in the past relating rainfall to hen predation on the
Yeah.
nests.
I wonder if it also has something to do with the sun, creating some shade on the nest, because
Yeah.
it's by default in an area that has a more well-developed understory with lateral cover like that, you're gonna have to have more canopy openness, right? The opposite of closure, like you were just talking about, being
Yeah.
important. And so as a result of that, there's going to be more sunlight coming through, heating the hen up. I wonder if like having some of that overhead shade, but not have it come from the canopy, but rather the vegetation that's actually concealing the nest, makes a
Yeah.
contribution as well.
Yeah, I could see that. It's definitely, you start getting in the deep south, and that'd be pretty
Yeah.
miserable to sit in a stand with 40% canopy cover all day long, in
Late April, yeah, early
Yeah.
May.
So I could definitely see escaping that thermal stress
Yeah.
being part of it as well. There's not, to my knowledge, very good data on those aspects of that cover. I mean, we're kind of inferring some of that. I think George Hurst had some work, I know that he did, related to the moisture and how that was influencing the hen, but I believe that they talked about the thermal environment of the nest as well. But one thing that I found really interesting when I went back through, this old text, I had missed a couple of studies that it pointed out to me that I thought were pretty interesting. I do think they are related to what we're talking about here, and that was, let's see, there was a study in Minnesota that was Jones 1981, one in New Mexico that's Gert, we'll go with 1983. The Lazarus and Porter paper that let's see, where was that at? That was the Minnesota one. And then one that I was a part of, the Kilberg et al. 2014, which wasn't covered in this book, but I just knew about the nest site selection in that.
Mm-hmm.
Hens tend to select mesic slopes,
Right.
which is kind of interesting to think about whether or not that's for some sort of thermal thing, or is it because that typically supports that vegetation structure more commonly.
The ericaceous shrubs.
Yeah. There you go. I wasn't going to go there, but if you,
I mean, this is a science podcast. We can use words like ericaceous, right?
Yeah. I can't spell it. But I thought that was pretty interesting that there are a number of studies that identified that pattern where hens tend to nest more on the mesic side of the hill. And that doesn't mean that they won't nest on a more xeric, drier aspect if the vegetation conditions are such that it supports that. But there has been this overall tendency for hens to select the wet side.
Yeah. That is really interesting.
Yeah, so I could see that being related to that thermal environment.
Yeah.
So that being said, there's also evidence of brooding occurring on the drier side.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we've talked about this before. I've heard John Grucci, for example, say something along the lines of, don't manage your brooding cover where it wants to be woods.
Yeah.
And, I think that's kind of speaking to that. Those drier aspects, tend to burn more readily, and you can often consistently manage for brooding cover in that, those higher and drier sites more easily than you can in the more mesic places.
Yeah, so if you've got like a field that's in a creek floodplain, lower lying, wetter area, trying to manage that for native plants in the structure and species composition that we often shoot for and we have described many times on this show, for brooding cover is going to be difficult because, number one, that site is going to go through succession really quickly because of its fertility and moisture content. But number two, a significant component of that vegetation is going to be trees that are trying to grow on that site. So it's already hard enough to create good brooding cover on drier upland sites with lower soil fertility, and you're just doubling down on the difficulty when you try to manage those areas in that way. So as a result of that, one of the things that I've started taking to doing on properties that I help landowners with is, those places are probably going to be clover food plots, and if we can still do some things so that they can receive use and help, with that overall recruitment part of the equation. For instance, we're not going to mow them down really low and keep them clean and all the weeds sprayed out of them. We're going to get a little bit more diversity and structure, but managing it that way versus trying to manage it for all of native warm season grass forb community that's good for nesting is going to be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So I guess if we're going to cover or kind of round out the selection, so that Johnson et al. Paper 2022 from Tennessee also showed, if you guys remember from our previous episodes with Craig, they showed pretty intensive selection in that same, in that study.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember exactly the numbers, and maybe you do. I remember that when we combined nesting and brooding cover, that was around 7% of the landscape, as far as I recall.
That's right.
And was it about 45% of the nests?
Yeah, it was a little under 50% of the nest occurred there.
Yeah,
and their nest success was about twice as high.
Yeah, well, I wanted to move to that next, where we talk about how much does the selection matter.
Yeah, because that's the other important thing. It doesn't matter if they select for it. Like, if it doesn't confer some kind of fitness benefit by increasing survival or reproduction, then why does it really matter?
Yeah.
But we have evidence that it does.
Oh, yeah. Well, I want to talk about a couple of things. One, there are publications that did not find strong selection for characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to put that out there. It's not that every study that's ever looked at this found a relationship, and there have been different things going on. Some of them aren't measuring lateral cover. Sometimes they may be in situations where there isn't a lot of high quality lateral cover available to select.
Yeah.
In some cases, they may not be doing the work at the scale of selection.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about some of the remote sensing work,
mm-hmm.
Where we have just like a a broad vegetation type identified from GIS.
Yeah.
So there's lots of investigations in this, and that work is needed, to try to understand what scale is selection occurring at and how common is it across, all these different contexts. So there are examples where selection has been relatively weak or they didn't detect any selection.
Right.
But I would say there's a really common narrative that the majority of these studies, many of which we've just covered, find selection, particularly for that lateral visual obstruction.
Yes.
And I will just tease people with it. We're trying to let this get published before we really go into detail, but we have a paper we're in the works right now showing selection, the clear selection for that lateral cover that's promoting visual obstruction.
Yeah. Well, it's been presented publicly at this point, Marcus. Why can't we just go into it? Golly, it's like opening a Christmas present.
I know. Well, we got to hold something for our audience, right? They got to be excited about something.
Yeah, well,
the turkey season.
And then there's that other paper that's an even bigger Christmas present.
I know
the vegetation part is like a stocking stuffer compared to that other piece that we're going to be sharing soon.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to tease people too much because we got a lot of great stuff that we can go ahead and go into.
If
here.
we tease them too much, I think that makes us bullies. So.
Is that what happens?
I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Oh, I guess the other one thing that I wanted to point out, we do have a video from Craig Harper where they went around in Tennessee and show people visually what hens were selecting and talking about how that translated into success or lack thereof of hens in that study. And personally, I've seen several videos like that where people are kind of talking about nesting cover, but that one to me is by far the best.
Right.
Quality, showing you real world scenarios where hens were making selection and then talking about what the consequences of that selection were. So
yeah, that's awesome.
We'll link that in the show notes, and I think we could probably even cut in some of the footage. If you're watching this on YouTube, we'll try to do that when possible. But yeah, that's a great resource that we'll link right here. So if you hadn't had a chance to watch that, or if you've forgotten, go back and take a look at it, because I think it's a great resource.
Yeah.
And we're going to start doing that with our data, as we're going with all these different projects and everything, because I think that's a really great way to convey to people visually what we're looking for.
Because that's what we're always telling them, is that they don't need to memorize a certain prescription for how to manage a property for turkeys. What they need to memorize is what the plant community they're after looks like, and then that can drive how they manage.
Yeah, make adjustments.
So this is a way to start building that data bank in your mind of, okay, this is the conditions that I'm after to have successful nesting. These are the conditions that I'm after to have successful brooding.
Yeah. Well, and I think getting refreshers on that is important. So like with that nesting video, save it and go back to it and look at it.
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to make plans or you're going out to evaluate things on your property, have a quick reference to remind you what you're looking for. So we're certainly trying to build a repository of information like that on the YouTube channel. So as we go and continue to get better and better data, and now that I have a team here where we can get some really high quality footage, hopefully that'll build up pretty fast. But I did want to remind people that we have that resource available so that you can visually see what we're talking about here on the podcast. Okay, well, do you want to go into some of the benefits that have been realized?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And you don't have any of those numbers in your face?
No, because I didn't.
You didn't know what we were talking about?
A little background story, folks. Like, Marcus and I came off of one recording for one group last night. We got done at 7:30, 8 o'clock Central, and then I had to do a quick turnaround and be on another show this morning at 8 o'clock. And Marcus got a bye on that one, so I'm rolling straight out of
it in person.
Yeah, I'm rolling straight out of that one into this one.
Yeah, and I guess before you did the recording last night, you were out in the woods stuck because you were out there burning.
Actually putting some fire on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. Making some good brooding cover.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so too. Okay. Well, I can go through a few things that I just happen to have slides that I have recently built out. And I have some of your slides too that you built out at one time sitting here in front of me as well. So I can cover some of these details, I think.
Yeah.
So one of Bill Porter's papers that I think we should start with is that it was that Porter et al. 1983 from Minnesota. And that was really about the body condition of hens.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what they showed in that study was that heavier hens had greater survival and they were more likely to nest and then had higher nesting success as well.
Makes sense.
So, that's something to think about. That Thogmartin and Johnson, 1999 from Arkansas, showed similar things where heavier hens laid larger clutches, nested earlier, and overall had greater nest success as well.
Yeah. I mean,
things that are...
I'm glad that they proved it, but I mean, all of that is very logical, right?
Yeah.
Starving hens don't make many poults.
Yeah. Well, and then you start to look at situations like what has been observed in Texas where you don't get rain, everybody goes into the nesting season in poor condition, and you have a very low nest initiation rate compared to, years where you have adequate rainfall and you have a flush of really high quality vegetation available. And then most of the hens invest in nesting, and nesting success and brooding success is much higher. I will note, I don't want to butcher it completely, and I don't have a quote in front of me, but it was interesting. I believe it was Bill Porter in the chapter on habitat requirements, but now I can't remember if it was him or Hurst in his chapter, noted that under good habitat conditions that you could see basically this positive correlation between reproductive effort, where you have higher conditioned hens, more of them nest, higher success, higher brooding success. And so that in some situations you could see a lambda over 2.
Wow.
And what that means for everybody out there is that you're doubling the adult population in 1 year.
Yeah.
Which is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So if we want to take a moment, I could probably find that quote, but I do remember that he specifically was talking about being over 2 when you're under really good conditions.
That's incredible.
And of course, that takes more than just having the vegetation available, right? There's obviously something going on at a larger scale we talk about all the time, where we have correlated reproduction across large areas, like across states.
Mm-hmm.
So there's other factors playing into that, but I'm kind of looking at it as if we provide them all of the habitat that they need, we're giving them the opportunity to respond to the good conditions with that huge, population increase.
Yes. Yeah,
like you're just preparing them to take advantage of it when it comes.
And maybe we're also buffering against the years that, have lower production for whatever reason. Yeah. So our high becomes higher, and our baseline, our low threshold is also higher as well.
Yeah. I think ultimately, that's what we want.
Yeah.
We want to raise the entire distribution so that the lows are higher and the highs are higher.
Yeah. Or maybe even if in the poor years we can't, pull off a great hatch, maybe we at least still carry over most of our adult birds to the next year. We help them survive.
That's something that's been noted in the past, is that even in situations where the nesting and brooding cover are poor, you can still have high hen survival.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily correlated.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point to make out, because a lot of times, even as, turkey scientists, we get so fixated on the reproductive vital rates, right? The nest and the brood. But let's not forget that a single nest loss, or even multiple nest losses, pale in comparison to losing the reproductive output of a hen over her entire life.
Yeah.
So if we lose that
potentially
hen,
have 6, 7, 8 chances at it.
Yeah. And it's not to say that those others aren't important. Obviously they are, or we wouldn't be talking about them, but don't lose sight of that.
Yeah. I think that's important. And, we know that populations tend to function in this way where the hen might need to live a few years to have the chance at that really big reproductive opportunity.
100%.
So definitely important. Okay, well, let's get back to nests. So I wanted to point out the Landy et al. Paper that was a review of all the data that's been published on easterns, the vital rate information. We covered it with Coulter Chipwood early in the podcast. It had referenced it many times since. In that study, they went through and found all of the nest vital rates and everything else, but we're going to focus on nests, and calculated what it was for the eastern subspecies overall, like what's the average for the species over all the studies, which in that case was 24 studies. On average, nesting success across all the studies was 38%.
Yeah.
I would say more commonly now, we're seeing nesting success in the 20-something%.
That's right. 20 to 30.
And I think Crawford et al., that's one of Chamberlain's group's studies, where they looked across, was it 8 areas?
9
Southeast?
9 areas in 3 states, I believe it was.
Yeah, it was across a broad range of the Southeast.
Yeah, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and they had several sites in each of those states.
Yeah. So they identified on average across all the study sites for the time frame that they were looking at, which I believe was through the teens, the 2 teens, like 13 through 17 or something like that. They were in the 20s on average. But I did find it notable that they had the Webb WMA represented in it, which is in South Carolina. It's a quail focal area. You can imagine what that landscape looks like, where it's high sunlight, really well developed understory vegetation,
Lots
like we've
of fire.
been describing. They also had Silver Lake in Georgia, which is a WMA that's quail focal area, I'm pretty sure, right?
Yeah. I don't know if it's a quail focal area per se, but I do know that it's got there's a lot of woodland savanna there that's burned.
Yeah. I think that it is a focal area, but regardless, we know that that is common. And those two study areas out of that whole study were the highest nesting success, and they were both 47%.
Mm-hmm.
To average 47%, it's pretty stellar.
I'd be real happy with that right now. And
Yeah.
the interesting thing, and I know you and I have had this conversation before, and maybe we've mentioned it on the air once, but it's been a while, is it seems like that 50% nest success rate is the number that keeps cropping up on good habitat, on what we would typically consider good nesting cover.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, matter of fact, from the Tennessee study, you remember 7% of the landscape was an early succession shrubland that was high quality nesting cover. 45% of the nests. They had 36% nesting success. However, 12% of the nests in areas that could be mowed were lost to mowing.
Yeah.
So if you add that back, we're back to that 48%.
Yeah. There it is again.
Yeah. So I really think that's what we're aspiring to is when we're providing high quality nesting cover, that's kind of where we're expecting
Yeah.
to get.
Yeah. I think it's like what I'm starting to feel is like good is anything north of 30%, better is 40% up, and then best is like around that 50% number.
Yeah. Now, there were some historical examples. I don't remember which papers they were, but they were outlined in that Landy et al. Paper. There have been some observations of higher nesting success, like 60-70%.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's reasonable to pull that off on a year-to-year basis.
No.
It seems like when we're managing really well, we can get up around 50.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty common threshold, it seems like.
Yeah.
Some other interesting things when the nest in that Tennessee study, when the nest had overhead cover, that equated to a 2% increase in nest survival per day.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you think about that nesting cover being on the low end or the high end, that 2% per day, it takes the nesting success on the low end of cover from the mid-20s, about 24%, to if you're on the high end of that cover where we're expecting about 43%.
Boom.
Just from that 2% per day.
Right up there in the low to mid 40s.
Yep. So, and that was, in this case, they were not discarding the ones that got mowed over. So,
right.
This one's a little bit lower probably.
Right.
But pretty compelling nonetheless. And I will also note, when we were talking about the lateral cover, they did quantify how much that lateral visual obstruction was affecting nest site selection by hens in that study. And they found for every 10% increase in visual obstruction at that, that key height for the hen, for every 10% increase in visual obstruction, they had a 2.2 times higher selection by hens for that cover to nest in.
I was just thinking about that when you brought that up and thinking about how we measure visual obstruction, and it's probably really foreign to a bunch of our listeners, but it might be cool to put together a little video showing us going out with a NUDS board and show people how they could do it, build maybe a little miniature NUDS board for their property, and they can actually go out and assess where they stand relative to some of these numbers that we're reporting.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We could definitely do that. We have people going out measuring this on real nests all the time.
Yeah. So, all you need is a little bit of plywood and some spray paint. So,
yeah. Well, I guess I'll encourage folks, if you want a video like that, I would assume those people probably watching on YouTube, leave us a comment below. And, if people want a video like that, we will produce it.
Yeah, and please do say that you want it, because that was my idea and I want it to be a good one.
Yeah. You could also leave us a comment. No, I think Will's
Marcus always is coming up with a more creative idea, so I get excited every now and then when I have one.
Hey, you come up with plenty of creative ideas. It's just, it's hard to match up against me. Like that. You're like ignoring all of the weaknesses that are really easy to stack up against me with. And the one thing that I tend to do relatively well, that's the one you're picking.
I wouldn't say I'm ignoring your weaknesses. I'm just a good friend, so I don't talk about those.
Okay.
But I'm well aware. I'm well aware of those.
Yeah, you and me both. And so is my spouse. If you would like to know what those are, just ask her. Yeah, so I think there's pretty compelling evidence that the hens, when they're given the option at least, are pretty strong selectors, particularly for that lateral cover, maybe secondarily so for that overhead
Yeah.
like directly overhead cover. I'm not talking about the canopy 40 foot up.
Yeah.
And maybe some other traits. There was a mention in the book, and I also have heard Mike Chamberlain's group talk about some nest site selection might be in relation to good brooding cover.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, hens might tend to choose nearer, better brooding cover.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are various things that seem to be influencing selection, but there are some consistent patterns in that selection, and particularly the unifying theme is that lateral cover.
Mm-hmm.
When you have that in the ground cover layer, that's much higher likelihood that she selects it.
Right.
And that there are consequences to that selection when she's able to select really high visual obstruction. And, if you add the overhead cover in on top of that, that can make a pretty big difference in nesting success.
I feel like there's no room to deny the role of habitat in, nest success at this point. And that, we've shown everything from hens will select for it when there's good cover present, and their success is higher there.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to get us on a sidebar here, but we already did that. We had an episode focused on it. I think we called it Habitat Management is Predator Management.
That's right.
We had an episode where we talked about this specific thing that I'm about to bring up, but not only are we managing for that visual obstruction and that plant community composition and structure that she's selecting, and that is conveying benefits, that we're thinking of from the hen's perspective, those same management strategies also tend to decrease selection and potentially relative abundance of nest predators.
That's right.
So, that's probably part of that net effect that we're seeing, that's benefiting the hen is, that raccoons don't like it.
Yeah.
And coyotes, and different things, we've talked about this at great length. I mean, when you burn in the home range of a raccoon, it creates a hole in the home range of the raccoon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That we have that data. You can see it. We've referenced it.
And think about it this way too, is, there's the first way that comes to mind for most people, and the most common sense way to prevent against that nest predation is to remove the predator from the area.
Yeah.
But
makes sense.
But we've talked many times on the show about the difficulty associated with that endeavor, right? There's all sorts of reasons that it's hard to, make a real dent in predator populations. But let's just assume for illustrative purposes that you're perfectly successful in removing those predators from that upland area. Well, in that case, where presuming hens are nesting there, in that case, all you have done is you've benefited the nest success by removing the source of predation. Whereas if you manage the habitat, you have not only decreased the predator relative abundance in that area, but you've also benefited the hen by improving the habitat. Right?
Yeah, you potentially increased her body condition, made it easier for her to escape, other predators that you can't target, or conditions that are unfavorable.
And it doesn't have to be a either or, proposition.
Right.
It can be a both and.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's probably where you stand to benefit the most from predator removal is when you have really good habitat, and the quail world has shown us that.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good studies on that.
If you're promoting this high quality cover and then adding in the predator removal, then maybe we can get up there in that 50 or more range.
Yeah. Maybe that's what it takes to get up there to 60, 70%, which is wild to even think about.
Yeah. We're not even getting 60 or 70% hen survival through the years.
Golly, much less nest success, right?
Yeah.
Well, that was a good one, and I think this is a good time of year to talk about it, too, because a lot of people are starting to think about it.
Yeah, perfect time. A lot of folks are starting to get their their burn gear out and get out in the woods and thinking about managing habitat. We're kind of between seasons, at least for a little while, and turkeys are on the mind.
Yeah, so, your nesting cover for this year kind of is what it is at this point. Yeah. But maybe some of this information will help you assess that and make determinations relative to other areas of your property, so that if you're not achieving what your objectives are, you can start thinking now about how you can manipulate those other areas so that next year you do have that better nesting cover.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, I think it's short and sweet and direct, but we've been getting a lot of requests for going into these specifics on life stages like this, and I think nesting was the right place to start.
Absolutely. And if y'all have any other ideas, feel free to share them and let us know.
Yeah, I think, assuming that people want this, we could do the same thing for brooding cover.
Right.
I know we're doing a bunch of work right now looking at roost site selection.
Right.
We've been getting a few questions about that. So we can go into these different things, if that's what folks want us to do.
Roost site selection. Why would a turkey hunter care about roost site selection, Marcus?
I have no idea.
All right.
Well, thanks everybody out there for listening. Hope you all enjoyed this. Thanks, Will, for everything. Sticking with this. Putting up with my insufficiencies.
I may have one or two of my own.
No. Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks everybody for listening. Leave us a comment or a review if you haven't had a chance. It's always helpful. Helps us get the word out to more people. But it's been a lot of fun. I'm excited, that turkey season's coming up.
Yeah, it is. And speaking of one more thing, we failed to mention that next weekend, if you want to get more down in the weeds, pun intended, with us on all these topics, we'll be live in Columbiana, Alabama at the 4-H Center there, putting on a workshop all day. Everything we know about managing turkey for habitat for turkeys, and most importantly, showing you examples of properties that we've helped set up to pull all that together.
Yeah, I think that's the valuable thing, and why we're doing it. So many people have asked us basically for that comprehensive look where we're putting all this knowledge together and showing people how to implement that on a property level. That's the forum that we felt like we could pull that off well.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be a great event. A lot of people are signed up. We can link it in the show notes if you're interested and available. We'd encourage you to come by and see us and participate in that.
Yeah.
But yeah, really exciting.
Cool. Hope to see you there. See you guys. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.